So, it was a very cold, crisp November morning. My wife and I were in bed, and we were kicking around the events that we were going to plan for the day. And it so happens, I remember the day really well. It was the last Sunday before the season of Advent. So why I know that is my wife's a traditional girl from the north of England, and every year, when we get ready for Christmas, we bake our Christmas cake. So, being the attentive husband, I was all ears. I was listening to every single word that Claire was telling me. Of course, as some of the guys might know, that's not the case at all. Claire was talking to me about we're going to do Stir-Up Sunday today, we're going to get the Christmas cake ingredients right, we're going to mix it up in a bowl, and we're each going to take turns to mix up the Christmas cake, and then we're going to put a coin in it. And of course, I was listening to all of that, whilst at the same time multitasking and listening to the other side of my brain that was telling me, tomorrow morning I've got to get on a plane and finish the coaching interventions with a CEO who was pretty dysfunctional. How am I going to tell this guy that he hasn't got all the attributes he really needs? So, as Claire was talking to me about ingredients, putting the right ingredients into the bowl, if you don't have enough of this, you don't have enough of that, it's not enough ingredients, it's not a cake. And with that, I leapt out of bed. And I said, leadership cake! It's leadership cake, that's it! She had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. You'd be pleased to know, for those of you that are visuals in the room, I was fully pyjamaed. And essentially, what took place was a kind of a light bulb moment for me. And at that point in time, I said to her, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book called Leadership Cake. She still hadn't quite worked out, hadn't been listening all this time, to the cake mix story. So after several moments of being apologetic and helping Claire understand that I hadn't really lost my marbles, and the fact that she'd helped me come to some conclusion, the leader that I was going to fly out to see that following morning, he had some really great attributes, but some of his key ingredients were just missing. He was a very effective leader, but he could be much more effective than he currently was. He also had some really essential ingredients that were just absent, they were missing from his cake. So I set to work and did some research. And it's really important from my perspective to understand, if I'm going to start now writing a book, I'm not an author, I'm a businessman. I'm a consultant, I'm a coach, that's what I do. So I spent months and months and months researching great leaders. Understanding specifically, amongst all of those great leaders, what were the things that made them good? And for those that had failed on their journeys in leadership, what was it that made them fail? And I want to share with you 4 people who, when I did my research, identified some real common traits. So the first person I want to share with you, Mahatma Gandhi. So this was an inspirational leader of his time. Someone who, without communication, mediums that we have today, such as mobile technology and the internet, was able to transform the beliefs of a government and British colonial rule, whilst at the same time communicate that message to a nation to protest peacefully. So Mahatma Gandhi, as an individual, changed a nation because his communication was outstanding. And communication is an essential ingredient in leadership. He managed to adapt his communication style, whether he was talking to government officials or he was talking to the man on the street. He was able to adapt. And I call these people communication adapters. And what I found about his story, which was remarkable, is that his background was quite humble. We're talking about 1947. Had he had a spoonful too much of communication, he would have appeared desperate. He'd appeared anxious. If he'd have tried over-communicating that message, it wouldn't have landed to the people who needed to listen. If he'd had a spoonful too few, he'd have lacked conviction. People wouldn't have listened. So communication is an essential ingredient in leadership cake. Richard Branson, for those of you who don't know Richard Branson, I'm sure that would be hard to find in such company. Richard Branson runs, still actively, 400 businesses globally, which is staggering. And Richard Branson has been typically known as being an authentic leader. Now, I get a little bit nervous when leadership advisors and consultants and coaches start talking about authenticity. The reason I get nervous is because it's become a bit cliche. Straight away you hear people like me on their feet saying, you need to be an authentic leader. Oh, okay, I need to be authentic. I'll just do that then. You can't just go and be authentic. You either are or you're not. It's as simple as that. And in leadership, it's an essential ingredient. But if we're not careful, it becomes cliche because it's the buzzword of the moment. And authenticity simply means just be who you are. Be who you are. I developed a little equation, and it's S plus D times B equals A. So what you say plus what you do, if you multiply that by how much you believe in it, you are authentic. If it's a high number, you're more authentic. If it's a low number, you're not going to be authentic. So authenticity is really important in the leadership cake. If you had a spoonful too much of authenticity, what would that look like? Well, how that would resonate with people is it would appear that you were trying too hard. It would appear that you're just trying to do something that's not right, doesn't feel comfortable for you. And the reason that that's important is you want to be trusted, you want to be respected, you want people to listen to what you're trying to share with people. If you had a spoonful too much authenticity, you start mimicking people. How many of you around a business environment often hear the latest business buzzwords that go on in business, right? That's because they're not theirs. They've heard somebody say it and they think, oh, that's really good, I'll use that. And that's okay to a degree, except when everybody starts using the business buzzword and you think, oh, not again. That's not authentic. That's mimicking. Now, that's very different from learning from great leaders and becoming more effective in your leadership capability. That's absolutely a byproduct and a good condiment to having a leadership cake. If you had a spoonful too few of authenticity, you could ever run into trouble. Because people need to know that you're there for them. People need to know that you've got their backs. And Richard Branson has not only got a huge amount of authenticity, he's a great communicator. Bill Gates, this is an interesting story. Early on in Bill Gates' career, he was seen as a tyrant. He was seen as somebody who you would not associate with being a great leader. But recognised that actually he needed to adapt his ingredients to become a more effective leader, and over time did so. So Bill Gates, he has a great way of doing that, and that's by hiring the best people, learning from them. So knowledge is the next essential ingredient. The reason why knowledge is an essential ingredient is because without it, you can't be effective as a leader in business. Anybody heard the phrase knowledge is power? Knowledge is only power, and powerful if you share it. If that filters through your organisation and people understand it. If you create a technical hierarchy in your organisation, that could be very powerless, because you end up with individuals who become so self-important in their organisation that they feel that they become so self-sufficient that you can't possibly fire me. And you also tend to find that because of their knowledge, they hide behind that quite a lot. So knowledge is only powerful if you share it. Bill Gates takes time to understand the knowledge in his business. It takes time to, when he hires great people, he spends time with them to understand what it is they do. If you had a spoonful too much knowledge, you create that technical hierarchy. And then you put people into a pedestal position. You also create an environment where people sometimes can't strive because they're maybe not technically minded in that respect. Spoonful too few of knowledge, as a leader, you're not going to ask the daft questions you need to ask. We all need, as leaders, to still continue to be restless and ask the questions. And it's okay as a leader not to be the subject matter expert and not the font of all knowledge, providing you know what questions to ask and to who. Jack Welch. Jack Welch is the eggs to our cake. So just like a real cake, if you were baking it, you'd have your eggs, your sugar, your flour, your water. Eggs bind cakes together, right? Empathy is an essential ingredient in leadership because it binds it together. And without it, it gets all mushy and gooey. 20 years ago, if you were an empathetic leader, you would have seen as being a light touch. But times have changed. If you don't understand your people, you'll never understand business. Empathy is really, really essential ingredient in people's cakes. Jack Welch, in the time that he was the CEO of GE, grew his business in 20 years by 4,000% because he took time to understand his people. He took time to understand what it was that made them tick, what it was that irritated them, what it was that were limiting them as individuals. And as such, created an enormous growth story within business. If he'd had a spoonful too much of empathy in his leadership cake, he would have stepped into being sympathy, not empathy. Sympathy is a disabling power if you're a leader, because you then become part of the problem. It's okay, though, to be empathetic and understand an individual, but not to be part of the problem. Spoonful too few of empathy? Yeah, so what? Is often some of the dysfunctional leaders I work with. If they don't understand truly their people, they can't understand their business. So, when you see a cake, and you see our cakes over here, you don't see the ingredients, you just see what it is. Well, leaders are the same. You know, when you rock up, you just see a leader. You don't see what ingredients go into it until you've had a bite. What we do need to make sure, though, is you get a bake a cake, you start with the raw ingredients. Okay, so once we've got our raw ingredients, these are the essential ingredients, not the only ingredients, because you'll need to adapt your cake and change it, and adapt and change, and add some condiments according to taste. For sure you will. Where we go next? I'm going to invite you to my bake store. And a quick show of hands. Assuming these cakes cost exactly the same money, they had the same calorific content, and illnesses aside, hands up who would have the right-hand side cake? Okay, that's reassuring. Of course you would. Leadership is very, very much like a cake. If you went to work for two companies or two organisations, and you had a choice, you got them narrowed down to the last two, you would probably make a decision based on who I'm going to work with. That's going to be a deciding contributory factor of where you go to work. How you get there is by having a huge, thick, whipped cream, fruit filling, which is a metaphor for personal development. For the leaders that I've worked with, the most effective leaders have been those that invested in themselves as much as they invested in their people. So the more energy and investment you put in your personal development, the more likely to want to go and share that with the people you work with. You're also going to let people know that that's okay, that's the culture, that's the way that we do things. For those that don't, you get stuck on the leadership cake shelf for a while longer. Because people buy leaders with their eyes and their senses, exactly as if you were going into a cake shop. What is this individual I'm about to work with? What is it they're saying about themselves? What is it they're saying about their leadership? Will it make a difference? So, I call this the icing on the cake, but in essence, this is just brand. This is personal brand. And we all have one. You all have one. Every single one of us has a brand, whether we are aware of it or not. We all have that brand. And it's what we say, it's what we do, it's how we act, it's how we behave, it's how we respond. It's all of the things that show, actually, I've got a cake inside here, I've got some ingredients, and on top it's just a cover. Equally essential is I've worked with some leaders who have a lovely butter icing. Loads of cherries on the top. They look absolutely fantastic. They've invested in the best suits. They've got the diamond-crusted watches. They've got the swagger. They've got the veneers. You cut into the cake, they're missing some E, or they're missing some A, and therefore the leadership underneath the cake's going to let people down. It happens. People buy leaders because of what their senses tell them. Equally important is to make sure that we understand what's underneath the cake. When you went to a big store last and you bought with your eyes and your senses and the lovely smells that come out from the leadership cake shop, you made a decision which cake you're going to buy, based on what you thought, well, you knew from your past experiences it gave you, right? So, once they've eaten your cake, what will they remember about that? So once they've worked with you and they've experience your leadership style, what will they remember? Well, they may not remember that you got a spoonful too few of C or a bit too much of E, but they will remember exactly how it made them feel. They'll remember exactly what it was like working with you. And the reason for that is just like when you bite into a cake, the 2,000 to 8,000 little tiny receptors you've got on your tongue tell you how it tastes, what was good or bad about it. Your brain does exactly the same with your emotions and how they process your emotions when you work with somebody. So if they were really great leaders, you remember they were really great leaders. If they were really bad leaders, you're most likely to remember what caused you to feel that way. So in essence, leadership cake is just a philosophy, it's a way of doing things. It's to get CEOs or leaders or junior team leaders to think about themselves differently. And in my experience, the easiest thing for a leader to do is just to plough on without having a recipe. And leadership cake helps that individual understand, what is it around my essential ingredients have I got? Have I got too much of this, not enough of that? What am I doing about my filling? Am I going to be more appetising than this cake, or this leader? So, people often say to me, so Steve, what is it that makes this approach to leadership different? And the reason it's different is it's a philosophy. Some of you may be familiar with this approach to learning and development. It's an approach that was born back in the 60s and has developed over time. It's a 70-20-10 philosophy. And the reason this is so important, and it's so important to everybody, is it's the way that we process and the way that we learn. So in essence, 70% of what we do is through experience and practice. And we learn how we do things at work, with our co-workers, with our boss, with our colleagues, and we learn through experience. 20% of what we do, we learn through networking. So much like we're doing today, and much like we do over a coffee at work, we learn through conversations and chats, and I've got a problem with this, can you come and help me? Or do you have any idea how I do that? And only 10% of what we do is formal face-to-face learning. And why this is kind of ironic is that most organisations that we work with, they think this is where they spend their learning and development budget, at the bottom here. Where actually, that's the least effective way you can spend your money, because the biggest way you can invest is investing in leaders, whether they be junior leaders or senior leaders. They're the people that are going to make the difference to your overall productivity. But it's ironic, the number of conversations we have with senior heads of L&D around, we need to do some courses. And the reason is because our leaders are responsible for the 70%. Actually, to a degree, should also be responsible for some of the 20% too. And why this philosophy fits is because if you did a learning intervention within an hour, broadly, you will lose half of that information unless you put it to work, unless you practice, which is a huge waste of money. If you're going to spend $2,000 on a course, and half of that money, half of that knowledge will be gone within an hour unless you practice, it's crazy. So, our philosophy is very simple. The book helps people have a little bit of self-reflection. It helps people understand their recipe. And there's an opportunity for you to do a little bit of self-reflection. We also really encourage people to get a litmus test, because you might think you've got a perfectly baked cake. You might think that your cake tastes wonderful, and your icing, your branding is wonderful, except that might not be the view of the people who work with you. So we've devised a process where you can follow the leadership cake philosophy and get a sense check with your peer group, your team, to see whether or not your cake is where you think it is. We support and encourage that the 70% learning and development philosophy should be undertaken on the job. So we support coaches to coach, as well as coach colleagues too. And of course, there's going to be some absolute relevance in making sure that we help people build the right recipe for themselves. And we do so through some experiential learning. And of course, if you just need a bit of a conscience break, we're really good at that. We're quite happily stand in front of your people and say, this is how we do things. So, From our perspective, Leadership Cake is not a model, it's not a tool, it's not a process, it's a way we do things. And it's a philosophy. And therefore, we invite you to take a copy of our Leadership Cake book with you this evening. We invite you to really have a good opportunity to have a look at your own leadership cake and how well, or not as the case may be, you're constructed, and whether your brand says what it needs to say. And we also encourage you that, whilst you're together, let's all kind of chat, collaborate, and understand how we can each help each other whilst we're together today. So we're really excited about working in the US. We're really excited about what the opportunity in the US presents for our clients and for our business. And we'd be really delighted to answer any questions you have or any queries you may have about what we do and how we do things. So what we're going to ask you to do now is we're going to invite you to have some cake and some tea and some coffee. And before you disappear today, there's an opportunity for you to take a book with you, which I'll gladly sign. We're more than happy to sign with you. But I wanted to say thank you ever so much for taking time out of your busy, busy schedules. I really do respect the fact that you're here this evening. And thank you very much in advance for your time today. Thank you very much.